Okay, so we're diving deep into the future of work today, and more specifically, how it intersects with mental health. I've got a fascinating read to unpack O Trabalho Protege.
Yeah, this book is a really interesting one, and it's a collection of essays from some leading voices in Brazil, including the team over at Jungle, who are doing some really cool stuff in the mental health consultancy world.
And it's about more than just like, here's a meditation app and a beanbag chair, you're good to go.
Right, exactly. It's way more nuanced than that.
It reminds me of, a few years back, every other article was about how companies needed ping pong tables and kombucha on tap to keep employees happy.
Right, like those are the magic solutions to burnout.
Turns out, not so much.
Not even close. There's been a huge shift. O Trabalho Protege really captures this moment where companies are realizing they can't not care about mental health anymore. And not just for good PR, but because it's a bottom line issue now. Did you see that stat from the World Health Organization? 12 billion workdays are lost globally each year because of mental health issues.
No way. 12 billion. That's insane.
It's a massive number. And it translates to something like $1 trillion with a T dollars in lost productivity.
Wow. So we're not even just talking about the human cost here, though obviously that's huge, but the economic impact is undeniable.
Absolutely. And the thing is, this isn't some far-off problem either. It's impacting businesses of all sizes across all industries right now. Rising healthcare costs, talent shortages because everyone's burned out. It's a big deal.
It really is. Which makes the title of the book we're looking at, O Trabalho Protege, kind of ironic when you think about it. It means work protects.
Yeah.
And yet...
Yeah, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Especially when you think about how taboo it was to even talk about mental health at work not that long ago. There's this really striking anecdote in the book about this Brazilian executive. He was so afraid to talk about struggling with depression that he would only agree to be interviewed if they kept his identity anonymous.
It's kind of wild how much things have changed, even in the last few years. I mean, what shifted? How do we go from like total silence to having these open discussions about mental health at work?
Well, the book dives into that, and it's a bunch of factors, really.
Yeah.
One of the biggies, though, generations colliding, honestly. Like, think about it. Older generations, they were all about that job security, stability above all else.
Makes sense, right? Different world back then.
Totally. But now you've got millennials, Gen Z coming up, and they're like, hold on. I want flexibility.
Yeah.
I want to feel like my work means something. And I want a life outside of this office.
Yeah, and they're willing to walk away from jobs that don't offer that, which is a big deal.
It is. They're not just going to grind themselves into the ground for a paycheck. It's more about alignment, you know? Like, do my values match this company's? Am I going to burn out in a year? They're asking the tough questions.
It's like that whole thing about valuing experiences over stuff.
Right.
Except now it's bleeding into the workplace.
100%. And on top of that, you've got this whole vibe shift, I guess. The world is, like, objectively more chaotic now.
Oh, tell me about it.
Remember you were talking about the book title, Work Protects?
Yeah.
Well, they actually talk about this idea of beige eye in the book. Have you heard of that?
I feel like I have. It's like, what is it? Brittle, anxious.
Brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible.
That's the one. And yeah, that sounds about right for the world right now.
Right. So it's like, no wonder work stress is through the roof. The whole world feels kind of unpredictable these days. And that's why the old ways of working, this super rigid, hierarchical, always-on mentality, it just doesn't fly anymore.
Definitely not. Okay, so what are companies doing about all of this? I mean, sure, the world's gone a bit mad, but are there any actual solutions happening?
Yeah, totally. And this is where O Trabalho Protege gets really interesting. There's a whole section on how companies are adapting, what's working, what's not. One of the coolest examples comes from Jungle, actually the consultancy that helped put the book together.
Okay, yeah. I want to hear more about their approach.
So they're taking a totally different approach to mental health in the workplace, one that's all about data. Remember those old employee satisfaction surveys with the, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how stressed are you? Questions.
Ugh, I can practically see the bubbles now.
The worst, right. And so surface level, Jungle's like, scrap that. They're using AI and this thing called neurolinguistics to actually analyze how employees are really feeling, just based on the language they're using.
Wait, hold on. Analyze how we're feeling based on what, like, our emails, meeting transcripts, that's kind of next level.
It is. But it's not about being Big Brother, It's about reading between the lines, picking up on those subtle cues that traditional surveys miss. They're looking for patterns in, like, the words we use, the tone of our communication. And get this, they actually found a link between the language a CEO uses and how well their company performs financially.
No way. Seriously. So, like, how a CEO talks actually impacts their bottom line.
It's wild, right? And it makes sense when you think about it. It all comes back to like mindset and emotional intelligence.
It is wild. So their AI can basically predict the future based on how a CEO sounds on like an earnings call.
Kind of. It's more about like, are they coming across as confident, optimistic, or are they, using a lot of negative language, hedging their bets all the time? Those subtle cues can really reveal a lot about their leadership style, their decision-making process.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. But I imagine some people listening are like, cool, but I'm not a CEO. What's in this for me?
Totally. And the book actually gets into that. While Jungle's doing some seriously high-tech stuff, the fundamentals they're uncovering apply to everyone, no matter your job title. It boils down to understanding what they call your engagement profile.
Okay, I remember that term from the book. What is an engagement profile exactly?
It's basically like a snapshot of what motivates you at work, what drains you, where your stressors lie, all of that.
So, like, are you someone who thrives on recognition? Do you need tons of autonomy? Are you a purpose-driven worker? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And they break it down into 6 key pillars: demand, reward balance, recognition, autonomy.
Right. And then there's belonging, purpose, and fairness, if I remember correctly.
Nailed it. And they argue that all 6 of those need to be in balance for a workplace to truly support mental well-being.
Okay, so let's say you're listening to this and you're like, okay, 6 pillars, got it. But now what? How do you actually use this information?
Great question. Let's take that first pillar you mentioned, demand, reward balance. The book makes a really good point about how one of the biggest drivers of burnout is this feeling of constantly being asked to do more without getting anything in return, right?
100%. Like more work, longer hours, but no extra pay, no recognition, no support. It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And that imbalance just breeds resentment, stress.
Yeah.
It's not sustainable.
So then how do we fix it? Do we all need to like start demanding raises and promotions?
It's not always about like demanding things necessarily. It's more about communication, I think. Like having open and honest conversations with your manager, your team, about your workload, your stress levels. The book actually talks a lot about how important it is for companies to create a culture of feedback where people feel safe speaking up about this stuff.
That makes sense. Like if you're constantly drowning in work, but you're too afraid to say anything, that's only going to make things worse.
Exactly. And it goes both ways, It's about managers creating that space for open communication, but it's also about employees advocating for themselves, setting boundaries, communicating their needs clearly.
Yeah, it sounds like it all comes back to communication, right? Building that trust so that people can actually talk about this stuff openly and honestly. Which brings us back to work protects. It's a great idea in theory, but what about when work is the thing that's causing the stress?
Right, like what happens when it's not protecting us? That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. The book even acknowledges that. There's no magic solution to make every workplace perfect.
Right, because every workplace, every person is different. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. But what this book does so well is like it gives you the tools to start having those conversations, It gives you the language to talk about mental health at work, to ask for what you need, to challenge the status quo.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this whole deep dive. It's about being willing to have those tough conversations, whether you're a CEO or, just starting out. We all have a role to play in creating healthier workplaces.
Totally. It's on all of us to be more aware, more empathetic, and to advocate for ourselves and each other. It's about building a future of work where people feel supported, valued, where work actually does protect us in a way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. If you're curious to learn more about all of this, definitely check out O Trabalho Protege. It's packed with insights. But for now, that's a wrap on this deep dive. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.